The Alamo, located smack in the middle of downtown San Antonio, Texas. This historic Spanish mission turned fortress is the crown jewel of San Antonio, as many Texans by now surely have figured out since San Antonio names its schools after it, its fireworks, and of course, its tamales. So many Alamos everywhere, San Antonians might feel a little like this girl.
Here's the Alamo, I guess.
Love it or hate it, this mission is extremely important both historically and in modern times as well. For example, in 2019, the Alamo attracted 1.8 million visitors, and I think it's safe to assume all those people came to catch a glimpse of Bella, the official Alamo cat. The preservation of this mission has not only been for monetary gain, but to preserve its historical significance as well. The Battle of the Alamo was of course a turning point in the Texas Revolution. The Battle of the Alamo was a 13-day siege culminating into a battle fought between a few hundred Texans and General Santa Anna, with thousands of Mexican soldiers behind him. An event that inspired a battle cry heard around the world.
For today, remember the Alamo!
But what exactly are we supposed to remember about the Alamo? And what's this stuff all about? A study titled The Alamo, Slavery, and the Politics of Memory found that following the rise of Anglo political power in Texas, only those who remember the Alamo, according to the nationalist narrative, are included in the National Project. So what does that nationalist narrative look like? The first big film made about the Battle of the Alamo in 1960 illustrates such a narrative on the silver screen.
Metal history-making motion picture, 14 years in the making, the $12 million epic, The Alamo. Starring John Wayne as Colonel David Crockett.
He's still on his feet!
Oh, no! Oh, yes! Oh, yes, and it's my turn. Recreating the 13 glorious days of the siege history will never forget, and you will always remember the Alamo.
The film was so historically inaccurate, it led two historians who worked on the film to later ask to be taken off the credits after seeing the movie. A review of the film by historian Steve Jones does an excellent job in critiquing the movie's blatant American nationalist motive. Jones highlights historical inaccuracies the film makes in an effort to instill American patriotism at the height of the Cold War. For instance, the film paints Davy Crockett, played by John Wayne, as a bigger-than-life patriot, a man's man. In the battle itself, Davy gets stabbed with a lance, but he has so much testosterone, he's able to break away the blade and toss a torch into a stash of gunpowder before he ultimately dies in his American glory. Pretty cool, but highly inaccurate. There's a lot of evidence to suggest Davy Crockett was actually taken prisoner and executed by General Santa Anna. However, in the nationalist narrative, patriotic heroes must always be in the best light and show no sign of weakness. Take General Jim Bowie, another legendary patriot of the Alamo. Bowie, who led the men at the Alamo, is seen courageously dying in battle, fighting for his freedom and dying a hero's death. But surprisingly, that's also historically inaccurate. In reality, Bowie fell viciously ill 2 days into the siege and was killed by the Spanish army in his deathbed. But that death scene wouldn't have been as patriotic or sold as many tickets. Historically, Anglo-Texans like Davy Crockett and Bowie rebelled over multiple issues they had with the Mexican government, including Mexico outlawing slavery. Anglo-Texans being Anglo immigrants from the United States were originally invited into Mexican Texas to settle. Slave labor was primarily used by said Anglo-Texans, including General Bowie himself, who owned and traded slaves for a living. It's hard to know the exact motives of every single man who fought at the Alamo, but what historians do know is, as a collective, Anglo-Texans were fighting to take Mexican land and to preserve the institution of slavery. But the movie takes a few patriotic liberties with the historical facts. According to Jones, in the Alamo, all the heroes know exactly what they are fighting for. an independent country based on American political values. You know, democracy, republicanism, natural right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, distaste for monarchies and aristocracies, and the right to be manly and left alone. John Wayne's interpretation of history has cemented the national narrative of the Alamo in the public consciousness. But I have to ask again, what's this stuff all about? The Tejanos played a crucial part in the Battle of the Alamo, the events leading up to it, and the events that came after. Generally speaking, the Tejanos are the descendants of the first Spanish, Mexican, and indigenous families who settled in Texas. Around 1835, 4,000 Tejanos lived north of the Nueces River, in contrast with Anglos who numbered about 35,000, most of them fairly recent arrivals from the United States. The Tejanos were in the position of being a minority in Texas, and consequently having virtually no political power. The Tejanos had a long history of qualms with the Mexican government by the time Anglo-Texans arrived on the scene. According to Boyo, a historian at the University of Texas Institute of Texan Culture at San Antonio, there is indication that the Tejanos preferred working towards independence through legal channel, while Anglos always had annexation by the US in the back of their minds, Boyo said. When open revolt was declared, the Tejanos had to make a decision, and they sided with the rebellion. 9 Tejano men died at the Battle of the Alamo, and many more would die in the Texas Revolution. In modern times, with historical context, it's clear the Anglo-Texans being successful in the rebellion created a world fit only for Anglos, a world where Tejanos would be horrendously discriminated against under the new Anglo laws and customs. Tejanos' complex role at the Alamo and the Texas Revolution has not only been overlooked, but purposely downplayed by even tour guides at the Alamo itself, all at the instruction of these women. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas. The DRT is made up of solely women who can trace their lineage back to a man or woman who rendered loyal service to Texas. The Daughters' long history with the Alamo spans all the way back to 1905. In fact, until 2015, the Daughters were the sole caretakers of the Alamo and not the city of San Antonio as one might think. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas also instruct and pay nearly every tour guide at the Alamo. A study done by the Journal of Tourism and Cultural Change looked at how the tourist industry the Daughters have built have shaped the narrative of the Alamo, and the struggle to include Tejanos within this narrative. In the study, dozens of tours were observed and 10 Alamo tour guides were interviewed. The study claims, from the early 1900s, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas controlled the Alamo with their nationalist Anglo-centric version of the past. They allegedly ignored its previous history, erasing the Tejanos who supported the 1836 Texas Revolution. No tour guides mentioned that before and after 1836, Anglo immigrants forced black men, women, and children into slavery, openly violating Mexico's constitution. The study even documents a dialogue between a tourist and a guide discussing slavery as one of the main reasons the Anglo-Texans rebelled. Democracy was most of all what they wanted, but they wanted slaves too, right? I mean, slavery was practiced, but it was just one of many issues. It was more than that. Originally, they had been permitted to make their own policies on things. And yeah, slavery was one of many issues. But you can't say it was all that important. The local democracy was the main thing. The local democracy the guide refers to was, of course, a democracy limited to only whites. The tiptoe rhetoric tour guides use when talking about slavery at the Alamo frames the Alamo as a victory for modern American values rather than the explicit racist values of the Anglo-Texans at the time. Modern Tejanos, natives, and all people of color who remember all the facts of the Alamo may see the Alamo and be furious at the fact that the men who fought for slavery are the ones being celebrated and remembered. Hollywood and tourism have perpetuated a narrative filled with historical inaccuracies centered around only patriotic Anglos. However, passionate historians, artists, and writers have made sure Tejano's sacrifice in the Texas Revolution is not forgotten by preserving and documenting the Tejano experience that runs through Texas history.